Welcome everybody to Go Local Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. It's a little gloomy in Providence, Rhode Island, so we're going to head down south to the University of Virginia. We've got Jennifer Lawless. She is the chair of the Political Science Department, and gosh darn it, there is a lot of political science going on around the country right now. Let's head to the college campuses, Professor. UCLA, pretty much a riot overnight. California police went in, both local and state, and started sort of breaking down the protest area. Your thoughts on all of the campus protests and how they're being handled in different areas of the country?
There does seem to be a lot of variation. I mean, I think the most noteworthy thing is the hundreds, if not thousands, of campuses across the country where there are small to moderate sized protests that are completely peaceful, that are not generating any big media attention, that aren't violating any school rules, that aren't resulting in encampments. And so I think it is important to acknowledge that there are thousands and thousands of college students across the country who are protesting in a way that is just sort of not newsworthy. And so it's important to remember that it's not like there's not political activity at these campuses. It's just not rising to a level that we're seeing at Columbia or UCLA or at the University of Wisconsin. As far as the attention seeking protests, and that's what a lot of them are, and frankly, most of them have been led by people who are actually not students. We're seeing quite a bit of, we're seeing quite a bit of attention and disorder. And
Yeah.
that disorder, I think, plays into a narrative that there's disorder on college campuses all across the country, and that today's young people, this is their Vietnam. And I just think that that's not true. The other thing that I would note is that there does seem to be quite a bit of variation in student demand. So the students at Brown, for example, had an encampment. They were negotiating with the president, and they came up with a settlement, and that's the end of it, and it's over. At Columbia, people took over Hamilton Hall. The footage of hundreds of law enforcement officials going into that building was somewhat jarring, but it ended, within 2 hours with generally peaceful arrests. And then you see what's happening at UCLA or Wisconsin or at the University of Texas, Austin, where, things are not such smooth sailing. So I think a lot of this also comes down to the relationships that the universities have with local law enforcement and, what the students' demands are.
Um, it, it seems interesting that many of the students are now sort of folding their tents as the end of the semester comes about, that this isn't really a long-term commitment. This is really just a short-term, let's get some attention, but at the end of the day, we're going to pack up, take our exams, and head off to summer fun. This is not a long-term encampment in which they're going to stay there this summer and protest at risk. There seems to be no risk to the protesters.
I think a couple of different things are going on. The first is that the seniors this year who are graduating from college did not have a high school graduation because of COVID. And so
Yeah.
for many of them, this is the first real opportunity to graduate with a degree. And I think that's a very real consequence of violating the school rules. We're already seeing schools like USC shutting down their graduation. So I think that that's a risk that a lot of the students were not willing to assume. The other thing I would note is that in a lot of ways, now is not and I shouldn't, I'm not promoting this, but now is not the best time actually to be protesting. The fall and during the election is when there are far more, potential consequences and an impact of their actions. And so I think even if they do close up shop and go home for the summer, that's not to say when they come back in the fall that this won't be renewed unless there's been major progress on a global level. And UCLA is really interesting because they don't have graduation for another 5 weeks. They're on a quarter system. And so any of the schools that are not having their graduation ceremonies in the next week or 2 weeks, it's unclear what's going to happen there because the threat of no graduation or the threat of the end of the semester is still several weeks off.
And there was real violence last night between a pro-Palestinian group and a pro-Israel group. It is unclear how many of those who participated in the violence were students or outside forces that came head to head. But there was pipes being wielded and people getting hit in the head and ambulances taking people away. Is that sort of the breaking point, though, for college presidents? When the violence starts, you've got to call in the police, the state police, the National Guard, whatever necessary to try and bring in some order.
That's part of it. I also think that occupying an academic building makes it impossible for the school to accomplish its mission, which is to provide an education. And I think that's why we saw the president at Columbia call in and work with Mayor Adams' administration to get the people who were occupying the building out. The one other thing that I would note, most of the students that have been speaking about the protests on both sides on various news outlets have been quite measured and careful in how they've spoken and the way in which they've described their demands and frankly the way in which they've described what's going on in Israel and Gaza. UCLA seems to be in a different category. They had a student on yesterday who was referring to Zionist thugs, and when asked how he knew that they were Zionists, he said that they believe in the existence of Israel. I mean, the UCLA protests seem to be in a lot of ways the heightened, they embody the heightened rhetoric that I don't think that a lot of these students actually do believe.
Okay, so let's look at it in the broader perspective of the presidential election in next November. And I touched on it last week of what the implications to the anti-war movement was on the '72 presidential election, where George McGovern, the Democrat, was sort of the favorite candidate of the anti-war movement. Richard Nixon was the establishment, pro-war Republican candidate. Is Joe Biden heading for the rocks? I mean, he's already got these ominous signs like the convention is in Chicago. Does he have a real problem with young voters who either will vote for Robert Kennedy or some other third-party candidate, or just sit this darn thing out?
I think it's too soon to draw that conclusion. First, I would note that they don't really have an alternative. They know that Robert Kennedy is not going to win the election, and they know that Donald Trump would be far worse on this issue than Joe Biden. It's also several months away, and frankly, I don't think that the current situation in the Middle East right now is sustainable. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is movement away from support for the Netanyahu administration from the Biden administration by the fall. The other thing that I would note, is that the stakes here, in terms of a global humanitarian crisis, there's no question that it's hard to imagine anything worse than this. But this is not Vietnam in that it's not the most important issue to a lot of people. So there's no question that young people have taken a position similar to the way that young people took a position in Vietnam. But if you look at the public opinion polling data, when you go back to 1968 and that convention, the Vietnam War and the potential of being drafted was the #1 issue for voters, and for young voters in particular. The current crisis in Israel and Gaza, the last that I looked, was ranked 17th. That was yesterday.
Yeah, it's at 2% of the adult American population say it's the most important issue. And for those under 25, it's 3%.
Right. So this is just, it's apples to oranges. Now, the visuals can convey a sense of disorder, and that will help Donald Trump. But I don't think it's the actual position in terms of, are you pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian, that's going to be a problem. It's really going to be like, to what extent do these protests embody an inability of the current government to keep things under control?
Okay, let's continue down in Washington. Marjorie Taylor Greene has announced that next week she is going to move on Mike Johnson. I think she has a second vote, which I think she needs to be able to start the process of removing Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House. How does this play out?
It's a foregone conclusion that the Democrats are going to save him. Hakeem Jeffries basically called Marjorie Taylor Greene's bluff, and because Johnson did work with the Democrats and decoupled Ukrainian aid from Israeli aid from Taiwanese aid, and then passed all of those bills, he has turned out to be somebody that the Democrats believe that they can trust. And at least heading into the election, it's better to know who you're dealing with than for there to be uncertainty or for there to be no ability for Congress to do anything or to govern because the Republicans can't agree on an alternative and a leader. So Mike Johnson's job is probably the safest it's ever been. And she's going to demonstrate that she's, basically just pandering to the cameras and that she has become increasingly irrelevant in terms of structuring leadership in the House.
But is she irrelevant or even more of a force because A, she gets all this attention from the media, we're talking about it in Providence and at the University of Virginia, and in the certain nutbag sphere, she's got direct mail money, I'm sure, flying in and online money flying in, where she's fundraising at a level she could never fundraise before.
I'm not saying her seat is up for grabs or that
Right.
she has created any additional electoral vulnerability for herself. But in terms of being able to shape what the Republican Party in Congress looks like or threaten a leader if she wants something included in a bill or if she wants a particular committee assignment, she's demonstrated now through her actions that she doesn't have to be taken that seriously, at least as long as Mike Johnson is Speaker. All of this said, if the Democrats don't win back the House, I think they probably will, but if the Democrats don't win back the House, the Republicans have to vote on a new Speaker when the new Congress convenes. And at that point, I don't know if, the Democrats are certainly not going to support Mike Johnson at that point. And her votes could become more relevant then. But between now and November, I think she basically rendered herself a non-entity.
Why hasn't Mike Johnson punished her? Why hasn't he stripped her of a committee assignment like the good old days and put her on the House Select Committee on barbershops? Why not that sort of Lyndon Johnson, Rayburn type of heavy-handed leadership?
He doesn't have to. He's able to maintain his position and do his job without doing that and without potentially alienating and isolating people who might not necessarily be supporting her motion to vacate right now, but who would be more inclined to say that she shouldn't be punished for putting it forward, given that it's consistent with the rules. So as long as he can maintain some semblance of support, and it's also important to keep in mind here too, remember that, the overwhelming majority of the Republican conference wants him to be Speaker. So this is not like the Democrats together are, making him Speaker and the Republicans are vehemently opposed to this. It's a handful of Republicans. And frankly, with the new, the special election results in New York on Tuesday, the Republicans now only have a 1-vote margin. Mark my words, if it turns out that 2 Republicans are sick on the day of the motion to vacate, the Democrats are not gonna vote for Mike Johnson.
Let's go to New York. I can't keep up with the schedule. Is today Trump trial day or is today an off day?
Wednesdays are off days. Today is a trial day, and I think they're going to be making the case. There's going to be the hearing about the 4 additional gag order violations.
The gag order violations, the $9,000 fine, the removal of multiple posts off of Truth Social, kind of turned out to be a nothing burger, though, didn't it really?
We knew the fines were going to be minimal because that's what New York state law allows. And frankly, the 4 violations for today, even if Trump is found guilty of violating the gag order, will only be another $4,000. What's more important is that the judge said, and keep in mind, these 4 violations happened before the judge ruled, so I don't think it'll apply to these. The judge said that if he's not better about this, he has no qualms about putting him in jail. And so my bet is that after these 4, if there is a future violation, even 24 hours in jail will likely happen and be on the table. The one other thing I would note is that yesterday, after the hearing, after Trump removed the Truth Social posts, after he appeared frustrated but somewhat chastened, he called the judge crooked. And so I assume that the prosecution is going to, again, raise an additional set of violations. Although it does seem to me that the judge is going to be far more inclined to want to protect the jury and witnesses as opposed to himself.
I thought the judge was fair game. The judge said, hey, listen, I'm fair game, but you can't talk about the jurors, you can't talk about court employees, you can't talk about those who are working the trial as professionals, public servants. But I think he has said that he is fair game.
My understanding is that the gag, that's his discretion. So in most cases, these gag orders, when they're talking about the trial, do include the judges. This judge, I think, will not act on a violation that pertains to him.
Okay. So in watching sort of the analysis that's been taking place, the prosecution seems to have a problem, which is that Michael Cohen, not only do we know that he's a convicted liar, is also not well liked by pretty much anyone, and they need certain information and testimony from Michael Cohen, but maybe even the prosecution doesn't like Michael Cohen. How do they weave through this and sort of thread the needle of getting Michael Cohen's key testimony, but not base the case of Michael Cohen versus Donald Trump?
Two things that I think have already happened that go in that direction are, first, using other witnesses to lay all of the groundwork. So in terms of setting up the catch and kill scheme, they relied heavily on David Pecker. They don't need to ask Michael Cohen to verify all of that. And then yesterday and the day before, Monday and Tuesday, in describing the way that these payments were obtained, they talked to Cohen's banker so that they don't have to go over well-trodden territory with Cohen. I think the sense will be to keep him on the stand as little as possible. The second thing is they've actually used the witnesses they've already called to say that they don't like Michael Cohen. Right? David Pecker doesn't like Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen's banker doesn't like Michael Cohen. And the key here is that you don't have to like Michael Cohen to believe that he was engaged in this scheme at Donald Trump's direction. And so it seems to me that the prosecution is already setting out permission for the jurors to think that this guy is quite unappealing, but to still take seriously the scheme in which he was involved and the cover-up.
So the prosecution might get him up and off the stand rather quickly, 3 or 4 questions, however many necessary, to get the key information from him. But the defense isn't going to be shuttling him off the witness stand anytime soon. They're going to be up there and going through all the times he lied, and proven to be a liar, all the.
So that's true, but I also think probably that what will happen is the prosecution will stipulate to all of that. So we know that he already served prison time for lying under oath to Congress. We know that he has changed his story multiple times. I mean, my bet is that the prosecution is actually going to try to cover all of that so that it can be covered in a way that narrowly tailors the question and keeps Cohen clearly on track. And then when the defense tries to revisit that, most of it, I think the prosecution is hoping, will be asked and answered.
Okay, let's go to Robert Menendez, the senator from New Jersey. His trial's coming up. Is the mainstream, we'll call it mainstream media, doing a disservice to their own brands by not covering that as aggressively and showing that they cover Republicans and Democrats equally? Menendez is in many ways, versus this Trump trial, is a much sexier, interesting allegations by the federal government, including functionally selling a seat to foreign countries for personal gain. His wife, I can't remember if it's a BMW or a Mercedes, the gold bars, the this, that, and the other thing. It is a information-rich trial. Shouldn't the cameras be over there? Shouldn't Caitlin Collins be posed on a dais with interviewing guests over there as well?
He's not seeking re-election. That's
what
makes
we,
it
we
less
don't we don't know he's not seeking re-election.
We do.
We know he's not running as a Democrat. He is withheld to say he is held out that he could run as an independent if he is found innocent.
Right, but he's basically not. He's not seeking. He's not going to run for re-election. And the idea of like holding out that he'll potentially run as an independent if he's found not guilty. I mean, the Democratic Party is heavily supporting, the Democratic candidate. It's basically he's trying to keep his political career alive, I think, for fundraising purposes. If he had announced that he was in fact seeking re-election, if he was engaged in a Democratic primary right now for the nomination, I think that the coverage probably would be a little bit more. That said, although it's a very, very sexy, sort of sexy set of circumstances, the reality is that it's not the presidential level. Yeah. And if the Trump trial wasn't going on right now, maybe it would rise to the top where they're looking for a political or a legal thriller or scandal. But as long as these multiple Trump trials are happening, it's hard to compare.
I don't know. This Menendez one is pretty darn good.
There'll be a movie. Don't worry. There will be a movie.
Will it be on true crime or will it be on like
Lifetime? Maybe it depends.
Yeah,
if they
Lifetime
from the wife's
or
perspective.
What My Husband Made Me Do for Love.
That's the title. Oh my gosh, how'd you know?
Looking out a couple of weeks, what should we be looking for?
Uh, so I think the most important thing is this trial, because after Michael Cohen is called, it's unclear that the prosecution has anybody left to call, and it's not obvious how aggressive the defense is going to be in terms of putting on a case, or if they're just going to believe that the prosecution failed to establish guilt. So that's one thing. The other thing is we're already beginning to see a real difficulty balancing courtroom presence and campaign presence. Donald Trump was out on the campaign trail yesterday in Wisconsin and Michigan, when probably he didn't want to be, but he's only got a handful of days where he doesn't have to be in court, and that's beginning to take a toll. And then the last thing I would say is this new Time magazine interview that is coming out and where excerpts have already been released, I think will be the main narrative that the Biden campaign is going to be focused on over the course of the next month or so. And in that interview, Donald Trump said many things that I don't think surprise Democrats or Republicans, but if used correctly and if messaged correctly, could be a source of concern for a lot of independents who maybe didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, did vote for Joe Biden, and are now not necessarily sure. He's talking about things and articulating them quite clearly that are explicitly anti-democratic, like not appointing anybody who believes that Joe Biden won the 2020 election, like like firing any U.S. attorney who doesn't go after somebody that he thinks it's important to prosecute, like allowing the states without any sort of push at the federal level to rein it in to pass anti-choice laws that are similar to the 1824 ban that Arizona finally just repealed. And so, when it's in his words and when there's text that can be put on a screen, I think the Biden campaign would be crazy not to take advantage of it.
With that, Jennifer Lawless, Chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia, as always, thank you very much. For everybody else, stay tuned. GoLocal's got a very interesting story about a Department of Health issue that's coming out later today. Stay tuned for that. A lot's going on here in Rhode Island in politics and in business, and we're on top of just about everything. Stay tuned for much, much more. Stay safe. Enjoy the weather.